I think discouragement is something that probably everybody faces at certain points in their life. Sometimes it's circumstantial, sometimes there are other factors involved. I want to look at the fact that even the Bible talks about some of the great heroes, some of the great leaders and people of faith in the Bible. Even though they served God and loved God, they still faced times of discouragement. And sometimes it was because, like we're going to look at David here, in Psalm 142, at the beginning of Psalm 142, there's a little editorial note to let people reading the Bible know what this chapter is going to be about. And in my Bible, it says, a prayer of David when he was in the cave. Now, I don't know about you, but caves hold no appeal for me. I see driving down certain interstate highways, to stop and see, if you're in Tennessee, or I see them out west, stop and see such and such a cave. Missouri, I've seen it. I really don't have an interest in seeing caves. If that's one of your hobbies, then great. If you're a spelunker, which I think that's what a person is who goes into caves, that's great. I just personally don't have an interest. And maybe they're beautiful. I might be missing all kinds of wonderful stalagmites and stalactites and all that. I just like being above ground. That's just my personal preference. David, when he wrote a psalm in a cave, it's not because he was a tourist. He was actually a refugee. And he was hiding from a king who wanted to kill him. As you may remember, when David was young, he served King Saul. How many of you remember that from the Bible? And Saul became literally insanely jealous of David. David had killed the giant. David had played the harp so beautifully and was anointed as a musician and a psalmist. And King Saul just got jealous of him and had thrown spears, javelins at David, trying to kill him. And now Saul has an entire army of men chasing David all through the wilderness, trying to kill him. And David is in a cave. And it probably was dark. It probably was, dank and just not. And so David picks up his pen to write. And this is what he says. Psalm 142, verse 4. He says, talking to God, he says, "Look on my right hand and see. There is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me." And I don't know, there's something about this next line that just kind of grabs my heart. He says, "No one cares for my soul. No one cares for my soul." And please understand, I don't say this with any critical tone in my voice. I've never been a refugee, from a fugitive from the law, where a king has chased me into the depths of a cave, people out trying to find me and kill me and things like that. But David makes this statement, "No one cares for my soul." From an objective standpoint, again, without being critical, we might say that David's kind of feeling sorry for himself. And let me just ask you the question. Maybe you've never had those kind of circumstances, but have you ever had self-pity? How many of you have ever had self-pity? How many of you have ever officially thrown yourself a pity party? Let me see your hand if you've, thrown that kind of event for your life. But David, it's one thing to, how many of you know it's one thing to feel something and acknowledge it, but it's another thing to stay there. David, in another place, in beautiful Psalm 23, David said, "Yea, though I walk through," everybody say through, "yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil." But notice David didn't say, "Yea, though I set up camp in the valley of the shadow of death." It's one thing to pass through something. How many of you have ever gone through something but you didn't stay there? And with God, when we have faith in Him, when we're committed to Him, we really are on a journey with Him, and we may go through various and sundry things. But David at this point he was at a low point. He says, no one cares for my soul, but he didn't stay there. In verse 5, he begins to turn around. In the very next verse, he says, I cried out to you, O Lord. Isn't that a good thing to do? Instead of staying focused on the fact that no one cares about him, or you and I thinking nobody cares about us, he lifts his heart up to God and he says, I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge. Isn't it better to say you are my refuge than to say what he said the verse before, refuge has failed me? David's beginning to shift this thing. He's beginning to turn this thing around. And he says, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. And then in verse 7, 2 verses later, David really begins to get a glimpse of hope. He begins to get his eyes off of himself, in despair and feeling sorry for himself. Nobody cares about me. He begins to get a vision that is different. He says to God, he says, bring my soul out of prison. Now, how many of you know, it's kind of interesting here, David physically was in a cave, but his soul, he said, was in a prison. How many of you know, just because naturally or physically you're going through a difficult time, you don't have to let it imprison your soul. Your soul can have hope and faith and trust. Your soul can be oriented toward a better future. But David realized he wasn't just physically in a cave, but his soul was in prison. And before his body ever got out of the cave, David began to look to God to bring his soul out of prison. He says, bring my soul out of prison that I may what? Praise. So David, in just a couple of verses, has gone from self-pity, feeling sorry for himself, to beginning to praise God. How many of you know sometimes it's really good to get our eyes off of ourselves and to put our eyes onto God? He says, bring my soul out of prison that I may praise your name. And then he makes this powerful statement. He says, the righteous shall surround me. Isn't it better to be surrounded by godly people that love God, than it is to be sitting there saying, nobody cares about me, nobody acknowledges me, and things like that? I just think that's one of the reasons that the Bible is so strong about believers getting together, because there's something about being surrounded by people of like faith. And one thing that's very important to understand is that, when you walk into church, everybody else may appear to be happy, and you're thinking, man, you don't know what kind of week I've had, but you don't know what kind of week other people have had. But when we all come together and just fulfill this verse, God, you're bringing our soul out of prison. We're going to praise your name. I'm going to be surrounded by the righteous. And then he says this, you will deal bountifully with me. So David goes from hopelessness to hope. He goes from self-pity to praise. He goes from feeling isolated to at least having a vision of connectedness and being surrounded by righteous and godly people. This is just a really good example and pattern for our lives, especially when we face times of discouragement. C.S. Lewis was probably the greatest literary mind of the 20th century, at least for Christians. He's an Oxford professor, wrote, if you ever watch Chronicles of Narnia, he's the author of that. You probably saw the movie, but he's the author of the book. And C.S. Lewis was talking about if Satan had to only have one tool or one weapon that he could use against Christians, what one weapon or one tool would Satan keep? And he said Satan would, if he had to, he'd lay down every weapon that he uses against Christians, but the one tool, the one weapon he would not surrender is the tool of discouragement. Because C.S. Lewis was saying that he had been so effective dampening the light in Christians' lives through discouragement. That is his most effective tool of keeping believers from experiencing joy and peace and really letting their light shine and all that type of thing. So we want to talk about passing the discouragement test. And I want to give you 3 particular stories from the Bible where different leaders, great people of faith, really genuinely felt discouragement. We already looked at David, but I want to look at him one more time about one of the times that he got out of the cave. He removed himself from the prison of me and began to see himself in the liberty and the freedom of we. He went from saying, nobody cares about my soul, to saying, the righteous will surround me, and we're going to praise God together. And I want to look at David in 1 Samuel chapter 30. This is another time, and this is what I love about the Bible, is the Bible doesn't try to make the characters of the Bible as some kind of superhero type people that, were impervious to all kinds of, problems. I mean, the Bible is just raw, honest, graphic in terms of what they faced and the emotions they had. Sometimes David is making these beautiful statements like, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not lack. It's the 91st Psalm, about the protection of God. Sometimes David is uttering these beautiful things. At other times, he's, like I said, kind of full of self-pity. Nobody cares about my soul. Sometimes he is livid, he is angry, and he's making statements like, God, break out their teeth, And so the Bible is just honest about what people go through. It doesn't try to present, believers as always just, going through life with no problems and no challenges. And here in 1 Samuel chapter 30 and verse 6 is really one of David's greatest challenges. And it says in 1 Samuel 36, it says, David was greatly distressed. How many of you like to be distressed? How many of you just wake up in the morning and say, God, I'm feeling pretty good today. I really don't like that. I'd really like to be really upset. Could you help me be upset today? No, we like being peaceful, right? We like having a sense of calm, a sense that everything's okay, and that, destruction is not just about to fall on us and things like that. But the Bible says in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, that David was greatly distressed because the people were talking about stoning him or killing him. Now, these were his top military people. David had led them on a military expedition. It went as bad as it could have gone. While they were out, on this military exploit, the enemy troops came in and kidnapped their wives, their children, their livestock, all of their possessions, burnt the town where everybody had been staying, and took off. And when David and his men came back, there was nothing. Their wives were gone, their children were gone, every possession they had was stolen. The town was smoldering in ashes and flames, and it was everything had gone wrong that could have gone wrong. But now his men say, you know what, this is David's fault. Somebody's going to pay for this. It's our leader. We're going to punish our leader by killing him. David's, again, back kind of feeling alone again. And, everybody's against him. And it says they were grieved. The soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and daughters. But aren't you glad things don't have to keep going the way they're going? When things are really heading in the wrong direction, how many of you know it's possible with God to see a change of direction? And a lot of times it just starts with a decision. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. I want you to know, when you're going through a challenging time, one of those sources, I'm not saying that we should look to ourselves instead of to God, but David did find a reservoir of strength within himself from which he could talk to himself. He could encourage himself in the Lord his God. As I read through the book of Psalms, I think probably the way David did this was by beginning to remind himself of all the times God had helped him in the past, of reminding him of all the times that God had been faithful to his people. Maybe even, God, I remember the time that it looked hopeless for the children of Israel, and yet Moses, when he trusted you, you split the Red Sea, and the people of God came through and experienced safety and deliverance. And David strengthened himself in the Lord, not independently of God, but using tools and knowledge that he had of God and of God's history of faithfulness. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Sometimes you need to be your own cheerleader a little bit. Sometimes you need to look at yourself in the mirror. A friend of mine used to say that it's a sad dog that won't wag its own tail. Sometimes you need to be your own cheerleader. And so keep that in mind. That's our first example. David, everybody say, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So he took the resources that God had put on the inside of him and used those to encourage himself and speak to himself. A second situation we want to look at today is a time involving the Apostle Paul. How many of you love the Apostle Paul? How many of you like Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Galatians and Ephesians, Philippians, all the great books he wrote in the New Testament that help us to know God much better, help us to appreciate Jesus? And Paul, he was a guy that went through a lot. He experienced a lot of adversity in life. And it says in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16, the first time I was brought before the judge. Now, how many of you know most people aren't really looking forward to being brought before a judge? Most people aren't wishing they could get arrested. And Paul got arrested many times, spent a good bit of time, years as a matter of fact, in prison because he was accused of this horrible crime of preaching the gospel. How many of you know in some parts of the world people are still put in prison for preaching the gospel? And Paul was dealing with, some religious intolerance here. And he says, the first time I was brought before the judge, what does he say? No one came with me. Isn't that tough? Paul had laid down his life. He had served so many people. He had helped so many people. He had comforted other people in distress. He had gone to people that were hopeless. He'd brought hope to people and encouragement to people. He had planted churches. He had raised up disciples. And now Paul is in trouble, and he's called before the judge, and he looks around thinking maybe there's going to be a friend there to go with him, and nobody's there. How many of you know people can fail? Jesus, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he wanted Peter, James, and John just to pray with him, and they kept falling asleep. So we understand human beings have their weaknesses and so on and so forth. But Paul said, the first time I went before the judge, no one came with me. Everyone abandoned me. May it not be counted against them. How many of you know when people disappoint you, you need to forgive them? You need to, just commit them to God. And because if you allow yourself to get into bitterness and resentment and unforgiveness and things like that, it's going to continue to weigh you down. You don't need to carry that toxicity in your life. Paul said, everybody abandoned me. May it not be counted against them. And look at verse 17, so powerful. But, here's another one. David was greatly distressed, but Paul had been abandoned by everybody, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. I want you to know, when people fail you, God will not. Jesus, I believe, is the friend who sticks closer than a brother. Somebody said, if you want to know who your real friends are, have a crisis. And that a real friend is somebody who walks into your life when the rest of the world is walking out. I pray that you don't experience this kind of thing where you're going through maybe one of the harder times in your life and people start peeling away from you and all that. But if you ever do face that, number one, forgive them. Number two, look to God, because He will not abandon you. He will not fail you. He will be with you. And Paul said, the Lord stood with me and gave me strength. And then the third one that we want to look at today, 2 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul's describing a totally different time in his life and in his ministry. Now, how many of you have noted Paul's attitude of victory in the Bible? In all these things, we are more than conquerors. How many of you know Paul said that? In all these things, we are more than conquerors. Thanks be unto God who always causes us to triumph. Paul's the one who said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. See, we're drawn to those because they're positive, they're uplifting, and every word of that is true. But how many of you know just because you believe something doesn't mean that you're not going to face a challenge in that area? The reason Paul believed that he could do all things through Christ is he'd pretty much been through all things. He'd been through shipwrecks, he'd been through prison, he'd been through beatings, whippings, trials, just all kinds of things. I mean, the litany of what Paul went through is just staggering. The degree of punishment and tortures that he underwent and pressures and persecution and things like that. And he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, he says, when we arrived in Macedonia, that's northern Greece, he says, there was no rest for us. Have you ever had a period in your life where you were just restless, where you were uneasy? I don't know how to determine whether this was physical fatigue or emotional fatigue. How many of you know you can have restlessness emotionally or mentally, even when physically you're resting? But sometimes, whether it was because Paul had been in prison, maybe he'd been on a ship in the middle of a storm. In other words, Paul's saying, I wasn't sleeping real good. And maybe there was emotional stuff going on too. He says there was no rest. But how many of you know Jesus said, come unto me, all ye that labor and are weary and are heavy laden. And Jesus said, and I will give you rest. Well, I think Paul knew that. But he was in a spiritual battle. He knew what to do. He knew to turn to the Lord. He knew to cast his cares upon the Lord. But how many of you know sometimes it's a battle to get through the adversity and opposition to get there? And Paul was just being honest. I was at a time, I didn't have any rest. He said, we face conflict from every direction. How many of you like dealing with multiple problems at once? I mean, it's enough just to be dealing with one big problem in your life. What happens when you're dealing with conflict from every direction? And he says, I had battles on the outside, and look at this, and I had fear on the inside. Some Christians who would never admit that. because they think, well, if I admit that I'm dealing with fear, if I admit that I'm, uneasy and restless, and people will accuse me of not having enough faith or things like that. And some people feel an obligation to always put on a happy face and act like everything's great when it's not. I appreciate that Paul was honest. And again, I don't think Paul intended to stay there. How many of you know it's one thing to acknowledge that you're having a problem? It's another thing to be determined to push through that and to come out on the other side. And Paul, what he's doing is he's not encouraging us to live in negativity or to live in defeat, but he's saying, hey, there was a time when I was having a really difficult battle in my life, and this is what it looked like. But notice what he says. Went through all this stuff, and look at verse 6. But God, here we are again. But God, who what? God encourages, say God encourages. But God who encourages those who are discouraged. So part of passing the discouragement test is coming to this place where you understand that when you are discouraged, God is for you, not against you. If you think God is disappointed in you because you're discouraged, if you think God is mad at you when you're discouraged, then you're going to tend to try to hide from God instead of running to God. Paul knew that God was for him. And even though he was going through a period of distress, he said, God encourages those who are discouraged. And what does he say? He encouraged us by the arrival of Titus. The encouragement came from a friend. God could have encouraged Paul through a vision, a dream, an audible voice, angels appearing to him. But God didn't do any of the things that are on that level of a supernatural encouragement. He could have. God encouraged him by a friend coming into his life. And he says, God encouraged us by the arrival of Titus. Notice what he says about Titus. His presence was a joy. Is there anybody in your life that has ever fulfilled that role of a Titus? That when you've been going through that kind of time that Paul went through, somebody came into your life and their presence was a joy? Somebody made this observation that, everybody brings joy. Some people bring joy wherever they go. Other people bring joy whenever they go. You ever been going through a tough time and spent some time with somebody, and as soon as they left, you're saying, thank God they're gone. Them being here just reminded of, I wasn't doing as bad as I thought I was. Just being with them was just, but Paul said God encouraged us by the arrival of Titus. His presence was a joy. But so was the news he brought of the encouragement he received from you. So here's the deal. Titus was with a church. Titus got encouraged, and then he took the encouragement that he got from the church, Corinth. Titus took the joy that he got from the church and gave it to Paul. You know what that tells us? Encouragement is contagious. Encouragement is contagious. Everybody faces discouragement in life, but God is the one who encourages those who are discouraged. And I just want to tie this together as we close. What we've seen are three different ways that people in the Bible went from being discouraged to being encouraged. Number one, David encouraged himself. David strengthened himself, not just with his own brilliance or with his own ability. David strengthened himself in the Lord. You know, the Bible says be strong in the Lord and in the power. It's not talking about being strong in yourself. It's not talking about just you having, thinking you're awesome and you can do anything. David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. Number 2, Paul received encouragement directly from the Lord. When everybody else forsook Paul, when everybody abandoned him, Paul said, "But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me." How many of you know how important it is to have a personal relationship with Jesus, where your door is wide open for him to come in and encourage you and help you? And even people have disappointed you and failed you, Jesus never will. And then third and finally, you can get encouragement from a friend. Paul was encouraged by Titus. And there may be people here this morning that you're facing discouragement. You've had a rough week, month, year, decade, whatever. You're thinking, God, I could sure use a Titus right now. You know what? I pray that God gives you that connection. That's why small groups are important. That's why prayer meetings are important. That's where just even informal fellowship is important. That's where the Bible's admonitions of love one another, care for one another, bear one another's burdens, serve one another. God made us a relational people. If you're struggling, there's nothing wrong with strengthening yourself in the Lord, letting the Lord encourage you, or having a Titus come into your life. But what's even better than asking God to give you a Titus is when you say, God, you have strengthened and encouraged me. Make me a Titus for somebody else. Let me be that person that my presence is a joy to somebody else. And then we begin fulfilling that, all the purpose of our life, the plan of God for our life by being light bearers and, being encouraging to others. Father, in the name of Jesus, I thank you for helping us. I pray for every person here who's maybe felt this week like they've been in a cave and that nobody cares for them. God, thank you for helping us, each and every one of us, never to feel alone, because we are never alone. You're with us. And help us to learn to encourage ourselves. Help us to receive strength directly from you. And help us to be humble enough to receive encouragement from our friends when you do send them into our life to be a joy to us. And Lord, thank you for not only sending Tituses into our lives, but thank you for making us a Titus even as we walk out of this building today. Help us to be a Titus. Help us to bring joy into other people's lives.